Thank you, Angela. Let me cover not only a few words of what I was originally going to say, but there's been so much good stuff that's come up. I'd like to try and weave in the next 15 minutes, some of the things that I've heard today which are important. What I would want to do is essentially cover a number of experiences working in the biodiversity area. I want to comment on some of the other work. I think John has helped me quite a bit in reducing some of the things that I need to say. But I want then to look at the comparison between biodiversity futures and both energy and climate change scenario work. And then I'm going to end on some of the elements of a research agenda, since that is where we want to lead to. I want to go back to the late 90s. This was work done to 2050. In many ways, certainly for me, this was a watershed project, because rather than as before working largely within single institutions, it was a matter of bringing together, in this case, 30 companies, 20 others from other institutions, working over some 18 months to develop a set of futures around the future of sustainable development. And clearly biodiversity has a role in here. It was very much in the context in the late 90s of working on the fact there were many new players in the system. We're looking at increasing connectivity. We're looking at a world where sustainability is a concept which had already emerged significantly in the late 80s and significantly in action terms in the early 90s was becoming important. 3 scenarios were developed. And I think the one thing to bear in mind, and I think John touched on this, but others have as well, if you don't frame properly the scenarios up front, the rest is frankly a waste of time, because it's the way you frame that matters, and who you frame for. And I think this is Bob's point. Who you frame for is essentially that widest set of stakeholders that you would like to use the work to take on the challenges of scenario and act. And of course it gets tougher and tougher the more you move from an individual institution through to, let's say, the regional country level, up to international challenges. The structure of these stories, and when I look at, for example, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, as I will in a moment, and other work, it's interesting, although nobody has mentioned it, that the fundamental framings tend to be around governance and institutional structures and the ability to actually direct attention to particularly environmental issues in the face, for example, of, in many countries, a dominant policy focus around economic and other issues. Is that right? I have a view on this, and part of it is because of the lack of adequate science that has moved into the area. You tend to focus on these external shaping elements, which are clearly not unimportant, but they can't be the only issues. A good example is here. One unsustainable story, frog storyline, is essentially frog. First, raise our growth. And that was very much a mindset prevalent in the late 90s, and you may well argue hasn't changed fundamentally. 2 sustainability futures. One was geopolity, which was essentially imagining you could solve these problems primarily through institutional change. New institutions, global energy, global environment organization. And jazz was very much a new concept at the time, to say the way forward is not about just large institutional change. It has to involve a multiplicity of groups, be they NGOs, be they business, and be they other entities. And in fact, the world that we've moved into, we've learned, certainly in the succeeding decade, the benefits of collaboration, although it isn't always apparent. This work, in an odd way, and it was completely a surprise, has actually lasted much longer than most scenario work has. It clearly touched a chord. If I turn to IUCN scenarios that were developed with protected area managers in 2003, the 3 scenarios came out. I'm not going to cover this in great detail. The first one was called the triple bottom line, and it really is looking at essentially policies that move in the direction that essentially will sustain protected areas. The second one was called the Rainbow, essentially a breakdown of certainly large-scale international institutional structures, protected areas essentially becoming much more independent with a large multiplicity or diversity of protected areas in the way they're managed. And the third one, which was very much a concern at the time, is that in fact the whole damn thing would get commercialized, that in the end World Heritage sites would get sold off to companies, and effectively they would become tourist visiting sites for the wealthy. And in fact, if you look around protected areas, to some extent you see a mix of these. What's interesting here, there's virtually no quantification. What was important, and this is not work, let me stress, the work that I do is not about me doing anything other than engaging people for them to build the work that challenges them. And that really is one of the key elements of good work. This is the assessment from Jeff McNeely, who was then chief scientist in IUCN and was the champion within IUCN for the work. Achim Steiner as well, before he went to UNEP. Achim in particular was quite interested to experiment with the tool. It's interesting what he saw in here because it's not in the analysis, but it was a catalyst for discussing, as they say, understanding biodiversity. It was used in quite a number of places. Promoting social equity, generating conservation incentives and finance, expanding international engagement. Engagement is a key feature of good scenario work, to essentially go to people and say, this is what we found, these are the sort of challenges you face. What can we do together to, in fact, look at new options? It's a trigger, a stimulus for good imagination and better options. And looking at ensuring sustainable ecosystems and livelihoods are focused on. And then finally, this is a tool, to what extent it's been taken up, IUCN can tell you, but it certainly at the time engaged people. And yet behind it, no quantification, no modeling, just really a tool to use for focus on new policy areas. In some ways, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment work was a watershed. I had the pleasure, certainly in the early days, going to some of the first workshops on the scenarios. There are a number of interesting issues in here. First of all, if you take the main framing, it just simply happened. And it's classic. I mean, it's, look, can we get our act together globally, or is it going to be regional? Are our policies going to be proactive in the way they address biodiversity issues, ecosystem services, or are they basically going to reactive? Actually, if you dig in, is about economic growth and public goods. It's a classic historical, or it's certainly a prevailing view to some extent. What's important here, and I think the point has been made by quite a number of people, it was a way of marshalling databases. Importantly, it was a way of getting modelling to be pushed forward. In my view, modelling, certainly up until here, was relatively rudimentary. The geo work, of course, and John's comments, extremely important. But compared, for example, with other areas, less developed. If we turn to some of the outputs, and this is typical of certainly much of the global analysis when it's taken up centrally, is really to use it as an absolute trigger to looking at new sets of options, provisioning, regulating, cultural changes. Obviously, to point out some of the big risk areas in some of the futures. In effect, what's critical here is the importance of new insights into analysis. And this is where extremely good modeling can help. And I would add there's a very strong difference in view by many modelers and many scenario practitioners about what is the role of both. Many modelers believe futures can be derived just by playing around with models and changing assumptions. Of course they can. And scenario practitioners are looking to make sure the framing is right. And these two don't always come together. When they come together, you have immensely powerful work. And I think that is the challenge we face as we move forward. I'll touch on that. More recently, we began to veer away from just straight scenarios. And this is important because we're probably in a world where we have to be very clear about what I would call sustainability corridors. There are real limits to retaining sustainable futures as possibilities when one looks at the putting together of climate change issues and ecosystem service concerns. And they come together in much of the work I'm sure we will be doing going forward. We need to be able to quantify both well. We need to learn from models. This work essentially was focused on a simple question, and that question was, if we were to achieve a genuinely sustainable world post-2050, and certainly be on track into that world by 2050, what would it look like? What do we have to do to get there? What are the options we have to have on the table? How should the policy agenda change with a focus on the coming decade? That work is written up, it's available, there's a whole bunch of stuff if you go to the websites. But it's interesting, biodiversity comes in here, but it comes in here embedded in the deforestation issues. In this case, individual companies took responsibility for different areas. We had some 30 companies involved. Weyerhaeuser did quite a lot of this analysis. Holcim worked on complete recyclability of cement, for example. A whole range of issues developed. This is a partial set of agendas for sustainability. And importantly here was this early period of turbulence in which policies get worked out through to 2020. So learning from the scenarios. By and large, scenarios have served well stakeholders. If you don't get that right, you have a problem. It's a basis for policy development and strategy. By and large, there's been no exceptional work. I think the last 5 years, listening to John, we're moving in that direction of really holistic analysis and limited, in my view, inadequate quantification. And part of the challenge has already been alluded to. We talk of biodiversity, we're interested in ecological systems. We're interested in their resilience and their sustainability. And within the ecology, we're interested in ensuring we don't have a sort of collapse of systems. So issues and concepts like, and I take Buzz Holling's work, panicky, we deal with nested systems as we move down, which need to be sustained in different ways at different levels. Resilience as a concept, the importance of transformation of ecological systems, protection of large ecologies is much more interesting as a working set of hypotheses with regard to how we should do our modeling. And we need that because when we look at the challenges of rapid climate change, we need to be able to look at the effects on biodiversity systems. Bob, faster than I can, covered assessments. I just want to make a point. I'm currently involved with a global energy assessment that has some 300 researchers, and we have some 200 reviewers to be reported on later this year. The critical issue in this work is again looking at sustainability corridors. We've developed policy tools, we've developed databases, which are much more focused on individual areas than just individual countries. Our interest here is ensuring a rigorous analysis of sustainable energy options for moving forward. And we had a very good session with some 40 ministers last week in Vienna who've underlined and underscored the work. And this work, which is funded significantly by the UN, is going to go forward. Now let me pass quickly. I want to just cover in my last minute or two a number of issues from what we can learn from other areas, energy and climate change work. We need to have extremely good science, and there are rapid changes in science. That's one reason why scenarios need to be made at times quite quickly. Scenarios degrade very quickly. You do 2050 work, it's pointless looking at the work 5, 10 years on, except in very rare situations. Modeling is increasingly sophisticated. That isn't always helpful. As John pointed out, you can point to the complexity of one model. When we did the 2001 stress work, we had 7 models. We had different databases, therefore different starting points. So you get quite important complexity built in when you get more sophisticated. And database developments are absolutely critical, and even more so at the moment because we have so much more that we need to work through. To conclude, what do we need on the research agenda? With an eye, and the eye I have is simply the following. We will not reach targets on climate change, and we'll have to start looking, and I'm sure we will at the next COP, at adaptation options. And we need to work very carefully on both climate change and biodiversity ecosystem services scenario together. We need, and the work that Kathy points to me is partly a revelation. I've not seen that work done, but it's that sort of work which we need to do both regionally, countrywide, basis for national planning, and equally to have a facsimile of that at the global level. We need the right metrics, databases and modeling. Much has been said on that. It's the dynamics of biodiversity and ecological systems that we need to get right, not just biodiversity indicators. Questions of how we address risks, you can take the Stockholm work on planetary boundaries, but we need to really ask ourselves, what is the best way? Is it through boundaries and thresholds? I haven't covered it, but social and political perspectives, ideological positioning, and the relationship with science are key and fundamental issues that need to be worked through, certainly in the political process. And let me end. So much of the framing at the moment is around governance and around our ability to address environmental issues. I am not these are fundamentally important issues, but whether they need to remain the fundamental framing structure of work is an open question. And I'm sure better science, good science, will change the way we frame. Good models, better models, we will learn from them and change the outputs and what we have to do. So let me stop. I've gone over time. Thank you.